Okay, so let's get going. Since I have you three here, and anybody else who filters in, they'll get the recording later. So, as implied by the title of this uh, room here, we are talking about Blurbs, which is the final part of the three-part series we've been talking about marketing copy during. So, it should be, with any luck, far more. It should build on everything I said before. I'm sorry if I seem a little off today. My brain is kind of a disaster, so we'll see how this goes. So, we're going to start by discussing what is a blurb. Sometimes called a synopsis, and that is an error. It should not be called a synopsis. But a blurb is a short description of your book's main character and the hook, the thing that gets you into the plot. Sometimes it describes a little of the story, but not much. It's usually between 100 and 250 words, depending on the genre, and it is essentially just a marketing tool to help people want to read your story. It gets people interested in, okay, so who is this character? What is their story? And usually it's just a part of your online bookstore sales page tactic. The other part will be a tagline. Some of the other portion may be reviews. There are other pieces that can go into the bookstore Amazon tag piece, and be aware that these blurbs are oftentimes partially hidden below the read more button, which is frustrating because if you don't capture somebody in the first line or so, they're gone because they can't see the rest of it, and if they don't click read more, they're not going to see the rest of it. So that is something to be aware of. So, in order to get into blurbs and discuss what they are, how they work, and what's effective, I have chosen several blurbs by obvious major international bestsellers. And we're going to start off with the iconic Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And here, I will read the blurb to you. So, yeah, that's one way of doing it, Lead. But I'm going to read the blurb out loud so that anybody who has trouble reading is able to engage with it. This blurb reads as follows. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. In the ancient times, the rings of power were crafted by the elven smiths, and Sauron, the Dark Lord, forged 1 ring, filling it with his own power so that he could rule all others. But the 1 ring was taken from him, and though he sought it throughout Middle-earth, it remained lost to him. After many ages, it fell by chance into the hands of the hobbit Bilbo Baggins. From Sauron's fastness in the dark tower of Mordor, his power spread far and wide. Sauron gathered all the great rings to him, but always he searched for the 1 ring that would complete his dominion. When Bilbo reached his 111st birthday, he disappeared, bequeathing to his young cousin Frodo the ruling ring and a perilous quest. To journey across Middle-earth, deep into the shadow of the Dark Lord, and destroy the ring by casting it into the cracks of doom. The Lord of the Rings tells of the great quest undertaken by Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf the Wizard, the Hobbits, Merry, Pippin, and Sam, Gimli the Dwarf, Legolas the Elf, Boromir of Gondor, and a tall, mysterious stranger called Strider. This new edition includes the 50th anniversary fully corrected text setting and for the first time an extensive new index. And then it continues on with a bio of J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien, 1892 to 1973, beloved throughout the world as the creator of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion, was a professor of Anglo-Saxons at Oxford, a fellow at Pembroke College, and a fellow at Merton College until his retirement in 1959. His chief interest was the linguistic aspects of the early English written tradition, but while he studied classic works of the past, he was creating a set of his own. This is directly off of the Amazon sales page for his book. So I just copied... Excellent. So I just copied exactly what was written on Amazon in this image you see here. Looking at this, it becomes obvious through the language that this is high fantasy. Not that anybody really doesn't know Lord of the Rings these days for the most part, but we're talking about hobbits and dwarves and elves, so it's obvious we're talking about fantasy with an epic quest going on here. At the top, you have the tagline, which is one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them. That line. It introduces the setting here. You can see he's talking about Middle Earth, and it talks a little bit about the history of Middle Earth, though not too much. It discusses how the Rings of Power were created sometime in the mists of history, and brings us up to now where we are following Frodo on his quest to destroy the One Ring. This introduces the main character, which is Frodo Baggins, though it starts by talking about Bilbo almost nonstop, which doesn't quite fit the book. However, at this point, a not as strong as it could be blurb is not a problem for Lord of the Rings, given its fame. So, it introduces the main conflict and adversary. We talk about Sauron, the Dark Lord, and it introduces the inciting event, which is the moment when Bilbo gives Frodo the ring, and Frodo starts his quest. Now, of course, Bilbo doesn't give Frodo the ring with the intent of him destroying it. That's actually Gandalf who tells Frodo that this has to happen once he realizes what that ring that Bilbo's had all these years is. So, as I said, this is not the most accurate blurb I've ever read. However, it is an iconic one. Can any of you pick out exactly what elements of this strike you as, the minute you read it, you say, this is a fantasy novel? Other than, some obvious pieces. Yeah, you can, right, like, Lead, I know you feel anger because I know you're a Lord of the Rings fan, then this is not correct to Lord of the Rings. Elven, yep, that's a good example. 11th birthday, yep, he turns 111 in the story, so 11th. Which is how Tolkien writes it in the book. It is very British. Is there anything else that stands out to you that says, fantasy? Because there's one element that I noticed. Yep, quest, that's a really good one. Wizard, yeah. So you guys are picking out individual keywords. For me, the thing that says high fantasy more than anything else is the way that the language is used. The tone is written in this broad, high kind of manner. And that is typically reserved for works of, like, Victorian fiction or high fantasy. These days, pretty much high fantasy is the only one that uses that broad, high tone that invokes quests and great stories and so on. Like, you're mostly going to see that in high fantasy. It reads like a 1970s van painting looks. It has that specific, there's a very specific flavor of wording. Okay, so you don't understand how tone works. That is a lecture in and of itself and how we use tone, but it boils down to tone has to do with which words you use to describe things. Very specifically, it has to do with how you describe something. If you you can describe a room in like 3 different tones or 4 different tones probably, and have it fit several different genres without the room looking any different. That's an exercise we can do in group, and we can definitely talk about that. So, this is the Lord of the Rings blurb. Again, this is copied right off of Amazon. I did not write this, so do not blame me for any inaccuracies in the blurb. I had nothing to do with it. Next, we are going to look at another blurb. This one is for Ender's Game, which is a very well-known sci-fi. And my cat is causing problems. Monster, please do not. Yeah, I know. Rawr, rawr, rawr. Okay, so Ender's Game. It is a famous science fiction young adult novel. I believe it's young adult. The blurb reads as follows. In order to develop a secure defense against a hostile alien race's next attack, government agencies breed child geniuses and train them as soldiers. A brilliant young boy, Andrew Ender Wiggin, lives with his kind but distant parents, his sadistic brother Peter, and the person he loves more than anyone else, his sister Valentine. Peter and Valentine were candidates for the soldier training program, but didn't make the cut. young Ender is the Wigan drafted into the orbiting battle school for rigorous military training. Ender's skills make him a leader in school and respected in the battle room, where children play at mock battles in zero gravity. Yet growing up in an artificial community of young soldiers, Ender suffers greatly from isolation, rivalry from his peers, pressure from the adult teachers, and an unsettling fear of the alien invaders. His psychological battles include loneliness, fear that he is becoming like the cruel brother he remembers, and fanning the flames of devotion to his beloved sister. Is Ender the general Earth needs? But Ender is not only the result of the genetic experiments. The war with the buggers has been raging for 100 years, and the quest for the perfect general has been underway for almost as long. Ender's two older siblings are every bit as unusual as he is, but in very different ways. Between the three of them, the abilities to remake a world between the three of them lie the abilities to remake a world, if, that is, the world survives. Ender's Game is the winner of the 1985 Nebula Award for Best Novel and the 1986 Hugo Award for Best Novel. Yeah, I didn't name them. Again, I take no responsibility for this. This is copied directly off of the Amazon sales page for Ender's Game. So, I have not read this book, I confess. I don't know a lot about Ender's Game other than the fact that it is extremely famous. However, I do know that it is science fiction, and it is about children, and I believe it is young adult centered. This blurb. Yeah, so the blurbs are usually written for adults, in this case, because obviously this is written for an adult looking to purchase the book, probably for a kid, and not all blurbs are gold. I'm not sure how this one stacks up to the book. It certainly doesn't grab me, but we can talk about that. So obviously this is science fiction. We can pick that out pretty quickly through hostile alien race. We're talking about, child soldiers in an orbiting battle school. These are elements of sci-fi, of course, space travel, dealing with aliens. It's probably in the future where there are kids who are out there fighting, and they have higher technology than we do now, since children are out in zero gravity in this orbiting battle stations, and these days, we don't have adults doing that. There's a whole lot of stuff that we can look at here and say this is science fiction. However, it's also young adult, so one of the things you will notice about the tone of this, and we were talking about tone a second ago because Nid was wrestling with that, you can see the words here are a little shorter. They aren't as high-sounding. When read aloud, they sound less like a passage out of the King James Bible and more modern. You don't have the same kind of tone. Now, granted, Lord of the Rings was written during a time when that style of writing was more common. It was really what was looked for, so this is something that you're going to see. And so we do have a difference in time period as far as the writer goes. However, the person writing the blurb, both of these are written recently. They are not antiques. So, obviously both of these were written since the birth of Amazon, which wasn't that long ago. You have the main characters introduced. You have Ender, Valentine, and Peter. I presume there are other very important characters in the novel who are not mentioned in the blurb. It introduces some of the conflict where you have Ender fighting kind of his own internal demons as well as trying to prepare for some sort of major attack. And yeah, well, young adult doesn't necessarily mean fluffy. There's some really heavy young adult books. Young adult at this point just means it is written for people between the ages of like 14 and 17. So those are, it's written, and also typically the main character is of a similar age, between like 13, 14, and 17. So really young adult is that. It doesn't have a whole lot of other genre requirements, so excessively dark is not something that will kick it out of the category. Extreme violence and extreme sexuality will kick it out of the category, but I've read young adult novels with sex and drugs in them that are pretty much on Front Street. Now, granted, all of the sex scenes are fade to black. You don't have anything graphic, but it's obvious these books were written for the 15 to 17-year-old age range whose friends may be dealing with some of that. Holly Black's Tithe and Ironside and Valiant are very, very dark and contain those themes, but they're not graphic either. So it is something to note that young adult doesn't have to be soft. You just have to make sure that you're not writing something targeted for 12, 13-year-olds with stuff that only 16, 17-year-olds should probably be reading. And unfortunately, there's no, like... Nid, I would not describe those in any kind of graphic detail. You can you can say it, Tanya, that's fine. We're here to learn. You don't need to apologize. We are here to understand things. But yes, we should not be describing awkward first-time sexual intimacy in any kind of graphic detail in a young adult novel. Absolutely not. You can describe the emotions and such, but anyway, we're kind of wandering off track here. We're here to talk about blurbs, not young adult specifically. So, obviously, Tanya, you said you read this book and this blurb does not do it justice. Can you describe what it doesn't do justice? Because I have not read this book, so unlike Lord of the Rings, I do not have strong opinions about this connecting to the source material. Beyond that, it doesn't really introduce the setting too much other than the fact that we're looking at futuristic Earth, but we don't know exactly how far in the future. All we know is that there's some kind of space travel and probably holograms. There's likely, obviously there's alien invasion, so Earth may not be in the best conditions since we've apparently been fighting bug-like aliens, but it doesn't actually teach us much about the setting other than I can glean that the setting is likely, for the most part, on this orbiting battle school, since it talks about that the most. The conflict here is mostly described as internal, though it does suggest that there is conflict with these buggers, I guess. And it does, in fact, ask a question. It's kind of asking the question of, can Ender do all of this? And can he and his siblings save/remake the world and make it better or not? So those are some questions that were asked in this blurb. Okay, so the blurb reads like a book report. Yeah, there aren't too many hooks in here, honestly. Like, the first line is a fact hook. We talked about those. Most of this just seems to be fact-based, and it does read as a little dry. It sort of reads more like a synopsis than a blurb. It reads more like, here's the stuff that happens in the book, to some extent. Though the very end of it, the last paragraph, starts asking questions about things in the story. So, is Ender the general Earth needs? ? That does invite readers to ask that question. And it does start looking, at other questions, and it hints that, maybe Ender is the chosen one, so to speak. It does kind of rely on that trope, which isn't a bad thing. Tropes are not your enemy. So, that is Ender's Game, and the blurb thereof. Next up, we have a blurb for a romance novel from Nora Roberts. Again, I have not read this specific romance novel, but I've read a lot of Nora Roberts, and it reads very much like a Nora Roberts book. It's called Hideaway. This one, unlike the others, starts with a review. So reading Hideaway is like a mini vacation as Roberts transports you to the sun-drenched mountains of Big Sur, to the rolling hills of Ireland, to the bustling streets of New York City, by the Associated Press. Next up, we have I'd almost call this a tagline, but it's more like a logline almost, but a family ranch in Big Sur country and a legacy of Hollywood royalty set the stage for Nora Roberts' emotional new suspense novel, Hideaway. Caitlin Sullivan had come from a long line of Hollywood royalty, stretching back to her Irish immigrant great-grandfather. At 9, she was already a star, yet an innocent child who loved to play hide-and-seek with her cousins at the family home in Big Sur. It was during one of those games that she disappeared. Some may have considered her a pampered princess, but Kate was in fact a smart, scrappy fighter, and she managed to escape her abductors. Dylan Cooper was shocked to find the bloodied, exhausted girl huddled in his house. But when the teenager and his family heard her story, they provided refuge, reuniting her with her loved ones. Kate's ordeal, though, was far from over. First came the discovery of the shocking betrayal that would send someone she'd trusted to prison. Then there were years spent away in Western Ireland, peaceful and protected, but with restlessness growing in her soul. Finally, she would return to Los Angeles, gathering the courage to act again and get past the trauma that had derailed her life. What she didn't yet know was that 2 seeds had been planted that long ago night, one of a great love and one of a terrible vengeance. So, I am 99% certain that this is a romance novel, given that Nora Roberts is not writing under her suspense tagline. So that is something that... However, this blurb does read more like one of her suspense mystery novels. It is, that said, a romance novel. And it is hinted at that, 2 seeds, one of great love, and it mentions Dylan Cooper, who we can presume is the love interest given its position in the blurb. You have this big ranch in Big Sur country, and you have this kind of log line that is that bolded part. You will also notice that there is bolded text in this Amazon listing. Bolded text can be an effective way of drawing the eye to that attention, and I can tell you that all that bolded text, for the most part, is going to be above the read more. I believe. It may cut off part of that, a family ranch in Big Sur country. I believe it may cut off part of that statement, but I believe most of that will show up before the read more button in Amazon. This introduces the main character, the female main character, Caitlin Sullivan, and introduces the mystery. So who abducted her? Why did they abduct her? What is this terrible vengeance they're talking about? It talks about a little bit about her journey as a child, her recovering from that abduction, which I presume this novel comes in with her as an adult. So them giving a little bit of the backstory of the main character isn't really going to be doing too much revelation that is going to be spoilery in the novel, because we're talking about these are the foundations of the story and things that happen prior to the story's inception. So, it introduces the male main character, like I said, Dylan Cooper, who's probably the love interest, and introduces this inciting incident, which is, honestly, Kate returning to Los Angeles to act again and face the ghosts of her past, as it were. This reads as a very suspenseful kind of almost crime drama, but you can see the romance elements in it. Are there any elements that any of you pick out as especially important when you're looking at this blurb? And again, remember, we're looking at this with marketing eyes, not necessarily just storytelling. Lead, we can discuss that another time, but it will be difficult for that to ever be considered child-friendly. You can make it young adultish friendly, but child-friendly probably not, because children's books rarely include discussions of that sort of thing. But again, we're kind of focusing on this blurb. What are some of the elements that you think are important? Scrappy princess is a romance trope. Yes, exactly. That's a good one. I also am pretty sure that the meeting between her and Dylan Cooper, the main characters meeting under less than ideal circumstances, is a common romance trope. Whether it's one or the other of the main characters having a bad time of it. That is a common thing. Any others that you notice? I see a few, but I want to give everybody an opportunity to weigh in. Yep, disappearing is mystery thriller. I did answer it, lead. Basically, it's not possible for it to be child friendly. You can make it young adult friendly, but not really child friendly. That said, we can discuss that in more detail at another time. Since right now we're talking marketing, and if I change gears in my brain, I won't be able to change back so easy. So yes, this is... You can see elements of the mystery thriller, which exactly you talked about the abduction, also the terrible vengeance. I feel you. ADHD is a serious challenge, and I have it too, so I understand the brain changing tracks midstream. That's why I'm trying to stay on topic, because otherwise I will galaxy brain and we'll never get anywhere. So we have the pampered princess. She's also smart, scrappy, and challenging, which is, as Tanya brilliantly pointed out, a romance trope. You have it's almost the childhood friend trope, where you have these two people meet a long time ago, where they are going to connect early and likely reconnect in Los Angeles and meet up and rekindle their friendship, and it's probably going to turn to romance, which is a thing, when the long-lost friend becoming the romantic interest is a big trope in romance, which is, again, tropes are not your enemy. They aren't the same as cliches, so recognizing them does not make this book any less good. I really enjoy Nora Roberts' writing, so I'm sure this is written brilliantly. So you have the thriller elements, the mystery elements, you have some of the romance stuff. You also have Kate going to spend time in Ireland, which is Nora Roberts' stuff. She has a long love affair herself with Ireland in her stories, so that is not a surprise. Ireland is one of the big themes in her writing. She has a lot of Celtic Irish characters. That's one of the reasons why I connected with her writing so much, because that's my heritage we're talking about, so of course I'm interested. You have the two characters. The inciting incident of the original story was the kidnapping, her going missing. However, we don't have the inciting incident for the current story, except for the fact that she's returning to Los Angeles, but there's going to be something that happens that draws her into the great love and terrible vengeance. I am not entirely sure this is the best blurb in the world. However, Nora Roberts doesn't really need excellent blurbs to sell books at this point, because her name alone sells books. If I know Nora Roberts wrote something, I'm probably going to read it eventually, because I know I like her writing, I know I like her style, so I don't need an extremely powerful blurb to draw me in. However, this one does a decent job. It asks questions. It gives a bunch of facts, talking about how things happened. She disappeared as a kid. There's a bunch of trauma and growth. It's implying that this is also going to be a story that is a triumph over past trauma, which is something that is a common theme in romance. A lot of romance novels have that, because written for women often deal with a lot of that, so that appeals to her target audience. This right here is written to appeal to her target audience pretty hard. That is another thing that we've talked about with blurbs and so on. Each of these is targeted to grab the target audience, except maybe Ender's Game, which I'm not sure would grab a target audience based on that description, but what they write on Amazon may be not what's printed on the back of the book if you go to Barnes & Noble too. So that's another thing. But this one right here is actually pretty well targeted to her audience. I believe I only had 4. Yep, this last one. Sabriel is one of my favorite books of all time. So here we have a tagline. I'm just going to read this again, and then we'll dissect it a little bit. Dark secrets, deep love, and dangerous magic. Sent to a boarding school in Enclestershire as a young child, Sabriel has little experience with the random power of free magic or the dead who refuse to stay dead in the Old Kingdom. But during her final semester, her father, the Aborson, goes missing, and Sabriel knows she must enter the Old Kingdom to find him. She soon finds companions in Mogget, a cat whose aloof manner barely conceals its malevolent spirit, and Touchstone, a young charter mage long imprisoned by magic, now free in body, but trapped by painful memories. As the three travel deep into the Old Kingdom, threats mount on all sides, and every step brings them closer to a battle that will pit them against the true forces of life and death, and bring Sabriel face to face with her own destiny. Sabriel is a winner, a fantasy that reads like realism. Here is a world with the same solidity and four-dimensional authority as our own, created with invention, clarity, and intelligence. Philip Pullman, author of His Dark Materials trilogy. Now, I feel like this does a really good job describing the book. Sabriel is a young adult fantasy. Yeah, I mean, Enclestershire is, that's very British, so if you can read British writing, and I believe Mr. Nix is British, it's okay. If you are not familiar with British writing, then it's going to be painful. Touchstone is also a nod to some British fairy tales. Just as a note, so that is actually an Easter egg of type. So, we have a tagline here, dark secrets, deep love, and dangerous magic. And I know because I asked him that garthnix wrote that himself. His blurb was written by himself and tweaked by his editor, but he did a lot of this work. And you can tell because it shows an intimate familiarity with the novel. We have the main character introduced in the first line, that being Sabriel. It introduces the conflict where it talks about the dead who don't stay dead and free magic and her father going missing. It introduces her companions, Mogget and Touchstone. And it introduces the hook. Her dad's gone missing, she has to go into the Old Kingdom and find out what happened to him. And then includes a review by a very famous author down the bottom. You will notice that two of these include reviews. The last one and this one. Both of those reviews came from big sources. If you're going to include reviews in your blurb, you want them to be from significant sources. Other authors, particularly successful ones, are a great source of these. If you are going to include reviews, make sure that they are not just like from your mother. As much as I love my mother, and as much as I know she writes beautiful reviews of my stories, she's my mother, and I don't know that anybody really cares about what my mom thinks. However, the author of His Dark Materials, who's writing in the same genre as garthnix, both of these are young adult fantasy, that has a little bit more weight. And also, it's a really good review. It gives a feeling of, okay, so this world is very concrete and feels real, which it does, I can confirm that. We have all of these elements that are brought into these blurbs here, and you can see them. This is, I think I said it already, this is young adult fantasy. It is written with an eye towards older young adult, so 16 to 18, because it deals a lot with dead things, and is, the main character is like 17, if I remember properly, 17, 18, because she's in her last semester of school. Which is essentially high school, like it's one of those schools that does K through 12, basically. We're looking at kindergarten through full adulthood. It's a boarding school. But you have this character who's getting ready to graduate, but she has to leave before she graduates because something happens. It doesn't tell too much about the story in other ways. I'm not going to spoiler it, but yes, Tanya, it is part of a series. It is book 1. It's Sabriel, Lyriel, Aborson, Clariel, and I know he's got a couple others out. Sabriel is just my favorite of the series. I think because of personal emotional attachments. I think you might enjoy the series. It's really good. But you see these elements. Again, on the left-hand side, we look at those elements that are in here. And the reason I keep bringing those up is because there are specific elements that need to be included in a blurb. Now, this last one is a nonfiction book, and I included this because nonfiction also has some similar shape to the blurb. So this is The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo, another book that I adore. It is in the category of, I would say, self-help, honestly. So here is the blurb. #1 New York Times bestseller, the book that sparked a revolution and inspired the hit Netflix series Tidying Up with Marie Kondo, the original guide to decluttering your home once and for all. One of the most influential books of the decade, CNN. Despite constant efforts to declutter your home, do papers still accumulate like snowdrifts and clothes pile up like a tangled mess of noodles? Japanese cleaning consultant Marie Kondo takes tidying to a whole new level, promising that if you properly simplify and organize your home once, you'll never have to do it again. Most methods advocate a room-by-room or little-by-little approach, which doom you to pick away at piles of your stuff forever. The KonMari method, with its revolutionary category-by-category system, leads to lasting results. In fact, none of Kondo's clients have lapsed, and she still has a 3-month waiting list. With detailed guidance for determining which items in your house spark joy and which don't, this international bestseller will help you clear your clutter and enjoy the unique magic of a tidy home, and the calm, motivated mindset it can inspire. I will check that out in a minute, but right now we're going to focus on this one. So this book is self-help. Again, you see a review, this one by CNN, which again, really big review source. The top bolds the fact that it's a #1 New York Times bestseller. That is a really big selling point. It mentions the Netflix series that this book inspired as well. It introduces the problem. The first line of this blurb, again, we're looking at nonfiction here, introduces a problem. The next paragraph provides the solution, and this introduces the author as an authority figure, talks about her waiting list, about the fact that she is a consultant, and it talks about how, she's really done very well, implied by those reviews. And she's not wrong. I really love this book. It introduces in some ways the character. You have Marie Kondo, the setting, which is your house being a complete disaster, and the hook is that first line. I also really like the way it's described. Do papers still accumulate like snowdrifts, and clothes pile up like a tangled mess of noodles? Now, those are obviously very Japanese descriptions of things, but they're still evocative, and they really do capture the mind. They're great. And this is a really well-written blurb that draws people. Yeah, exactly. It's got a lot of imagery for a nonfiction book, and it's got really nice imagery, too. Like, the book is written like this, also. The way this blurb reads, this kind of happy, simple, focused, step-by-step, we're gonna do this together kind of imagery, is exactly how the book is written. So we have a perfect match here between the tone of the blurb and the tone of the book. It is a 1-for-1, and it's great. So you have that all right here. And also with Sabriel, the way that blurb reads matches the way the book reads. That is something we're going to talk about too, making sure your blurb tone matches your content. And I know that is an issue for some folks. We can really dig into what tone is and how to use it in a future lecture, because honestly that is a very long, complicated discussion. So I threw in a nonfiction here because nonfiction blurbs are also, you can see similar elements. So finally, we're going to get to the formula for a blurb. Now, when I say formula, you don't have to do it in this order. This is more like an ingredients list for a blurb than it is you have to do these things in this order. But I should have titled it ingredients list, but formula is close enough. And also, as I say here, it does vary some genre by genre. Certain genres will have certain elements to them that have to be there. However, this is focusing on fiction. Nonfiction has a different list of requirements, though they're not entirely different. So you're going to introduce the main character or characters. In a romance, you introduce the two main leads, or 3 or 4, depending on whether or not you're going to do a reverse harem or a harem romance. Those are there, but you're going to introduce the main character or characters. You're going to introduce the setting, by which I mean, is it sci-fi? Is it fantasy? Are you in Middle Earth, or are you on actual Earth, or are you on Pern? Where are you? In Sabriel, you're in Clestashire or the Old Kingdom. You're going to introduce the main conflict or the main hook in the writing. This is not the same as the marketing hook, but this is the thing that really is going to get people to read your story. And you're going to introduce the tone and genre. What I mean with tone here is if your book blurb is written like the Marie Kondo book blurb, like really sweet and happy and fluffy, and your genre is really dark, grim dark fantasy, it's not gonna work. You're going to have a huge mismatch there. And it's not gonna, they won't fit, and it's just going to be a problem for everybody. So as a result, you're going to be needing to make sure that the tone of your blurb, which means, is it happy, is it dark, is it suspenseful, is it romantic, that is going to have to match the tone of the book. This came into play last week when we were talking about taglines, and I was asked, could somebody make a really punny tagline for a book that isn't comedy and doesn't include a ton of puns? And, well, yes, you could. It's sort of not selling the right thing, because if the book doesn't match the tagline or the blurb, it isn't going to fix. Right, parents getting bamboozled by the cover of Watership Down. Yeah. My parents knew what was in that book, and they let me read it because they were like, if you want to read it, okay, we won't stop you. They warned me, but they didn't stop me. So that is a thing. Other elements that you're going to include, maybe not, depending on whether or not you have them or whether or not your genre includes them. A tagline. You will notice that not every single one of those really included a tagline per se. Some genres may or may not have them. Marie Kondo's didn't really have a tagline, though I guess you could argue that the first line of the blurb was sort of a tagline in a way, but it does introduce the problem. Second, it may or may not include a question, like a direct question to entice a reader, and it may or may not include important reviews or awards, like #1 New York Times bestseller, or the fact that, I think it was Ender's Game was a Hugo and Nebula award winner. You have Lord of the Rings, which of course is very storied history and has a lot of awards. I think Sabriel also has a number of awards. Your blurb can definitely include those important reviews and awards, but there is a really common thing going around these days that folks actually get really upset about. There is a great deal of frustration around the fact that there are a lot of books that have nothing but reviews on the back cover and awards listings on the back cover, and it doesn't actually tell you what the book is about. There are a lot of people who are really frustrated by that, and so I strongly recommend actually using a blurb, and don't just put a single line amongst reviews that you've received, because that won't really get you anywhere good. So those are the things that blurbs absolutely must include on the left, and some elements that are optional on the right. If your blurb does not introduce your main character, readers will not be able to connect with the main character of the story. They're not going to know who they're connecting with and why they care about the story. Introducing the setting helps create the platform for the genre. If you are talking about Middle Earth, you're pretty sure you're reading a fantasy novel. Pretty sure. If you talk about how the setting is on Mars, probably going to be a sci-fi. So that can go a long way towards helping create expectations for genre and tone, because, again, Middle Earth, the way that's written, that whole tone, it's obvious that it is high fantasy, and it's very broad and classic, almost fairy tale type work. And introducing the main conflict and hook, that's going to be the thing that gets people to read. Without that conflict or hook, they might not read the book. They need to know what's at stake here and why they're picking the book up. And of course, the genre and tone, which I've been harping on nonstop. So, when I was on Twitter, I actually saw garthnix. I tagged him in a comment about the fact that I grabbed sabriel for this description, and he responded. We had a conversation back and forth, and I asked him, what is something about blurb writing that you really think people should know? And he answered by saying, like a lot of things in publishing, it is an art informed by science. Studying a wide variety of blurbs and practicing different approaches is good. I wrote many blurbs when I was an editor and agent, and as always, practice should improve your ability. Avoid spoilers and straight synopsis. So, yes, as he said, do not just write a synopsis of your plot. Because if you're writing just a synopsis of your plot, it's not going to grab anybody. Sabriel isn't just... The description on the blurb for Sabriel isn't just going to be a... it isn't just a description of the synopsis, because honestly, it tells you the story of, like, it gives you a snapshot of what happens in maybe chapter 1, and maybe chapter 2, because I think she meets Touchstone in chapter 2, but either way, like, it's a very tiny sliver of the story, but it is the part that's going to get people to kind of come in, and then the rest of the story unfolds, and they're really going to enjoy it. So, he did a really good job on that blurb, and I know he wrote it because he told me. And he's a very nice guy, so if you ever have the chance to interact with him on Twitter, do so. He's really nice. And his writing is excellent if you like young adult fantasy. I have not read a bad book by him. So that is something to be aware of. And he is entirely correct that blurb writing is an art informed by science. And the reason he said that is because I mentioned that I'd been doing a lot of research on blurbs and reading just a ton of them and trying to pick apart the elements that need to be in them and comparing all of these things in preparation for this lecture. And he said that that was the right thing to do. Like, there are a couple other tweets above this one that I didn't include in the screenshot because I just wanted to share the advice that he had. But when you're getting ready to write blurbs, again, just like the taglines, find books in your genre and look at what they do. And you're wanting to look for the bestsellers. Don't look for, person who sold one copy, because obviously they're not doing something right. But if you look at the bestsellers in your genre, and generally speaking, we call those comps, the comparable works. Look at comps. Look at what they say and how they say it, and don't be ashamed to pick pieces apart. And I'm not saying to copy-paste. I'm not saying to plagiarize, but hey, they used this method of, like, they introduced the character here, the setting here, the other thing here. Like, they created this formula, or they used this method, or they used these keywords to indicate genre. Don't be afraid to utilize those keywords and that method and those techniques in your blurbs. And another, just like the taglines, start writing blurbs for books you've read. So Tanya, you're a big fan of Ender's Game. Write a new blurb for it, since that one does not obviously fit what you think Ender's Game was. Take a look at other YA sci-fi novels and see what they do and kind of put it together and write a blurb for that. That's how you practice. You don't have to just stick within your genre. You can also write blurbs for books you have read and enjoyed. Preferably sticking within whether or not you're, writing fiction, nonfiction, because nonfiction is a very different animal from fiction. You will learn techniques that will work for both, but they are different creatures. So if you're writing fiction, I do suggest mostly practicing fiction blurbs. If you're practicing nonfiction and writing fiction, you're going to end up with a mismatch. And that is something very much to be aware of. So that is the last piece of advice I have here. So that is the end of this presentation. So scrolling back down here, does anybody have any questions about blurbs specifically? Is there anything that I can do to make them make sense to you? Also, I do, yet again, for the third time in a row, recommend Book Blurbs Unleashed. I forget the author's name, I will dig it up, but that is the place that I had been doing a bunch of research and study on blurbs specifically. I'd been studying copywriting too, but I also want to thank my friend Melanie for help. I bounced a bunch of these ideas off of her. She's a marketer and she kind of helped me shape some of this. You're very welcome, Tanya. I'm glad that you found it useful. I hope other folks do too. But are there any questions about blurbs or even taglines or hooks? Anything we've covered in the last 3 weeks? Since this is nice. Yeah, I hope this inspires you to write your blurbs. Like, you can workshop them in the group. We've got channels for that. So definitely, like, feel free to toss down some ideas. And if they aren't good, that's fine. We'll make them good. And you can write multiple blurbs until it's published on your book cover, and after that, well, then you're stuck with it. But until then, you've got plenty of room. Nid, I know you'd mentioned something about tone. I think I'm going to start doing a lecture series on things like tone and characterization in novels to help explain some of those terms to folks. I think that's where we're going to go next, is we're going to start talking about some of that. But, so I can't answer that question right now because it is a big question. And is going to require some space, and we've got, 4 minutes left. But I will answer that question for you and lead, talking about, young adult or children's friendly novels and how to include more adult themes in them. That's something we can discuss also. To acknowledge those subjects that you wanted to talk about. But is there anything else in our last few minutes that you folks would like to ask or go over? Also, how did you like this new platform? Like, does this work for you? Yeah, I kind of like it too. I do like Discord, but I sort of like the auditorium feel. Um, it's going to get better as I learn how to use it more effectively. I'm sorry, lead. If you can let me know what you dislike about it, maybe I can find a way to make it more usable. I'm still figuring out how it all works. Yes, there is in fact presentation mode that you can make the slides bigger, or you can drag the corner of the window and make it bigger so you can see everything. I was using presentation mode during the recording. Fair enough, lead. Understandable. All right, I think in that case, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you all for coming. It is always good to see you, and I appreciate you sticking with me through this experiment of mine. I'm hoping that as I continue to get familiar with this platform and start marketing these more, it's going to be better, and we're going to start getting more people, because I've been publicizing this on Twitter, and I'm going to start publicizing this on TikTok and other places. But that's also going to allow the Discord group to stay on the smaller side. And smaller side by, we have 100 people, but I want to keep it mostly to the active folks who are participating and not just folks who want to come listen to me babble every week. So, thank you very much, and I hope you all have an excellent day.